looking at during Abu Dhabi Art is looking at dissecting GCC narratives. And today specifically what we're looking at is the role of collections and collectors. And this is our first talk of the season and of the run. On the panel we have Porter, Oliver Mousset, Mohammed Afkhami, Wehirfie, and of course Debra, who's going to be moderating the talk. So I'll, with that said, hand it on.
Thank you, Munira. Thank you very much.
It's such a privilege to be here today. Thank you to the wonderful panelists, and thank you to the audience. I know it's the first talk of the series, and it's early on in the day, so thank you so much for being here. The role of private foundations and public collections is a subject very close, I think, to all of our hearts as we try to see how we can contribute to a growing cultural scene in the Middle East, but elsewhere in the world as well. And Munira's brilliant proposition of a panel and of a conversation brought, I think, for all of us, so many questions and such opportunity to raise subjects that we are constantly debating with ourselves and with our fellow art practitioners. My name is Debora Najjar, and I'm the founder of a not-for-profit institution in Dubai called the Jean-Paul Najjar Foundation. We're a private museum. We've been in operation for 18 months. And 2 days ago, we had the great privilege, upon Hervé Mikailof's idea and with Olivier Mosset's incredible support, to open a beautiful exhibition spanning 50 years of Olivier's career. And for us as a private institution, it's been really a turning point, and we'll touch upon this later, to have the support of the diplomatic corps through the Swiss embassy, but also the private sector through ADS Securities, who believed in the importance of this exhibition and of supporting it. And it's interesting to see how the private sector, how philanthropy, and further down the line, how public institutions can collaborate. It's an exciting year, 2017. First of all, Abu Dhabi Art under a new director, Diala Nusseibeh, and such a wonderful team. And it's exciting to be here. And of course, we're all waiting to discover the Louvre, which is an incredible moment in all our collective memories. It's the beginning of something that will change the Middle East and indeed, I think, the world. So very exciting. What I'd like to do now is to introduce the panelists and then dive right into the subject. So to my left is Venicia Porter, and Venicia is an assistant keeper, that's a curator, in the Department of Middle East and Islamic Contemporary Art at the British Museum. She's the lead curator for the Al-Bukhari Foundation Galleries of the Islamic World, which will open in October next year, and we so look forward to it. Venicia studied Arabic and Persian and Islamic art at the University of Oxford, and her PhD is from Durham, on the history and architecture of medieval Yemen. She has curated several exhibitions at the British Museum, including Hajj, Journey into the Heart of Islam. That was in 2012, and I think we'll talk about it in a little while. The focus of her research and publications range from Arabic inscriptions to contemporary art. To the left is Olivier Mosset. Olivier was born in 1944 in Bern, Switzerland. He is the son of a chemical engineer and the grandson of a watchmaker. Olivier undertook classical studies in Neuchâtel, Switzerland, and settled in Paris in 1965. After his formative years in Paris and the experience with the BMPT group, he left France for the United States in 1977. He shared a workshop on Broadway with the Swiss painter Grégoire Muller, and his minimalist monochromatic abstractions have been featured in several solo and group exhibitions around the world. His works can be found in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art, Centre Georges Pompidou, the Migros Museum in Zurich, and the Cantonal Museum of Fine Arts in Lausanne. Olivier Mosset lives and works in Tucson, Arizona, and traveled all those kilometers to be here with us in the UAE. Mohammed Afkhami is the founder and managing partner of Magenta Capital Services, which acts as an advisor in capital placement to private equity, real estate, and infrastructure firms on capital placement in the Gulf region. Mohammed is also a managing partner of MA Partners DMCC. He is a a founding member of the British Museum and Guggenheim Museum Middle East and North African Art Acquisition Committees, an advisor on the Board of Art Dubai, and a patron friend of both the Sharjah Arts Foundation and the Aga Khan Museum. Over the past year, Mohammed has also exhibited a part of his Iranian art collection with the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto and the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, under the title Rebel, Jester, Mystic, Poet, Contemporary Persians. In addition, he has published 2 books on Iranian art, the most recent of which by Faidan Press, called Honar, Afghami Collection of Modern Contemporary Iranian Art. Mohammed is the founder of the Mohammed Afkhami Foundation, which finances an annual scholarship for Middle Eastern students at his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania. Wehirfie Mikailov is the founder of HM Conseil since 2010. He's an independent art consultant and curator, currently advises the LVMH Group since 2004 and the Louis Vuitton Foundation, which opened in Paris in 2014. In 1991, the native Frenchman graduated from l'École du Louvre and worked at the Fondation Cartier, Galerie Emmanuel Perrotin, and Caisse des Dépôts and Art Collection. Wehirfie Mikailov is also an art advisor for Sanofi, Big Group, and private banks such as Pictet, and many private collectors around the world. Wehirfie was the curator of many shows at the Espace Vuitton, Paris, Venice, and Hong Kong from 2007 to 2015. He is the curator of the retrospective show of the Swiss artist Olivier Mousset at the Jean-Paul Najar Foundation, with the support of the Swiss Embassy and ADS Securities. Wehirfie received les insignes du Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres, which you're not wearing today, by the French Minister of Culture in 2011. Voilà. So, to dive right into the subject, I'd like to turn to you, Venicia, and maybe you could tell us a little bit more. Your title is such a wonderful opening to this conversation, Assistant Keeper, and I wonder if you'd explain to us how this role inspires your actions, and maybe a little bit of how you see how the way you do this in such a reputable public institution could influence how we should do it in private institutions.
Thank you very much, and it's really a privilege to be here amongst all of you and to be at Abu Dhabi Art. It's just so fantastic. It gets better every year, and today, as you said, this is a really amazing time to be here. So thank you very much for inviting me. Assistant Keeper, yes, it's one of these, can you hear me? It's one of these titles that nobody understands at all, actually. It is basically a curator, but the idea of it is that you are assistant to the keeper. The keeper is the head of the department, and the British Museum has about 10 different departments, each one which is like a mini museum in itself, actually. But it means that you are sort of responsible to the keeper, but what you are is a custodian. And this is the most amazing thing about being a curator, is that you are, for a short time, there looking after these absolutely extraordinary collections, and in my case, it's the Islamic art collections, but also what I've been doing in recent years is building a collection with the help of people like Mohammed and other members of the Camia group who are here in force from the British Museum. And so this is really the role of the curator is just for a short period of time. I mean, I've been in the museum for a long time, but I see my role as a transitory one. And so we're there to look after these collections, make sure they don't fall apart, to bring them out to the public. And our role is very much as a public institution. We're free, and that's very important. And our aim is completely visitor-focused. So this is all the time what we have to think about is when we put out material on display. And you kindly mentioned my role in these Al-Bukhari Foundation galleries of the Islamic world, which are going to open next year. And with a team of curators, what we're doing is sort of rethinking how we display the collections of the cultures of the Islamic world, a vast region we're covering in our galleries, from West Africa to Indonesia, basically from the 7th century to the present day. So what we're doing is putting out a lot of material that we haven't before, and we can talk about that later on perhaps, but so that's in a nutshell. Our role is to preserve, to acquire for the future, to present material, not necessarily to interpret, but just to present material for the public of today and for the public of the future.
It's such a beautiful word, custodian, and I wonder, Olivier, as we turn to you, it's wonderful to have the perspective of the artist and
Yes, well, of course I'm grateful that there's collectors, because that's what keeps this thing going on. And I don't know, I think it's Frank Stella who said art is what other people do. So we're also grateful to have museums, because that's where that's what we question, and that's what keeps you going on too. So I think this is what I should say. Now if you have some questions, I can try to answer. But
could you maybe tell us a little bit about how public institutions and private ones and collections have maybe helped you over you have a very long spanning career and a very high degree of recognition. How do they weigh into the building of your legacy?
I mean, the nice thing is that private collection often ends up in public collections, and that's the way it ought to be. And well, you know, I had some other people's work too, and I was actually happy to be able to give it to museums, because you can always go back and look at them. So I think that's the way it goes. So we're really grateful for all the people who are interested in this business.
Olivier, I think you mentioned to us in the past few days that you're based in Tucson, Arizona, and you...
Local artist who started in Tucson, and we got from the city a nice space. But no, what's interesting these days is that you used to have a system which, you know, before the war, Paris was a center, New York suddenly became a center, and still is, but then now it kind of exploded. That means you can be in different places, and being here also, it's fascinating, because you realize how global this discourse is these days. So no, I guess you can even be in Tucson and look at stuff.
Thank you. Mohammed, Olivier just said something, and I'm sure you'd love to bounce off on it. Mohammed, you're a third-generation collector now, and you've had, as we said earlier, some wonderful exhibitions of your collection.
So when we look at, let's say, the plans for the collection, the priority, at least in my mind, is to get it out in the most visible way. And whilst I love the idea of having my own sort of permanent setup, I think for now, Iranian art remains still under-discovered, and so being able to show it in the most global audience in these very established locations, whether they're in Toronto, Houston, London, New York, Paris, the footfall and the traffic you get from those existing museums that have spent, frankly, hundreds of millions developing their programs would be very hard to compete with as an individual. So we look at it in a way where we could run effectively like a virtual foundation, not an actual presence, but one where you disseminate the work, you collaborate with museums, you come up with innovative structures, and ultimately you give a part of it to those institutions, because that'll be the true way to ensure you have a chance for your works to survive in a public format. I mean, we did an interesting thing the other day. We had a discussion with Houston, and we had our collection there, but after the collection left, they said, look, we really want to have this work that's coming out by a major artist, but we don't have the budget for it. So there, we came up with an interesting sort of approach where everyone's a winner. We said, okay, the artist doesn't want to sell except to a major institution. The institution doesn't have the budget. So I said, look, we'll fund it. We'll loan it to you for 10, 15 years. And then at the end of that, we decide whether we take the work back into the foundation or just ultimately give it back to the museum. These are sort of clever ways where everyone's a winner. Because you continue to build your collection, you get your hands on a piece that you would otherwise not get. The museum gets the right to display it for effectively a perpetual period. And so, you know, there are clever ways to do things. And so we're thinking about it in that way. And ultimately, if we can form a place where we have a hub of our own, that would be nice. But the main priority is to keep the museum show going as much as possible.
Thank you. Hervé, I think you've had a number of experiences with both public and private institutions, and working closely also with the artists and with collectors. How do you see the perspective of private becoming public, and how we can indeed have the best discourse?
Actually, I start my career as a curator, as you mentioned, for a state bank in France called Caisse des Dépôts, and our goal was to, from one side, to make a contemporary art photo collection, and also to help museum to produce new art of young artists, and to make a loan on deposit, a long-term deposit on the museum. And in 2002, they decided to give the work to the museum. Should I start? So. No, I just want to say that I started to work as a curator for a French bank, and this French bank was helping the museum system in France to produce and to acquire works for their own collection. And after a certain time, they gave the collection to the museum. We had an exhibition space in Paris, but we didn't want to have a museum by ourselves, because I think it was a nice connection that an institution, a bank institution, had a strong link with a museum, on could acquire works that the museum cannot afford or didn't have time to do it. So I never opposed the private initiative to the public. I think it's very complementary to it. And now that I'm working for about 14 years with Bernard Arnault, I started this contemporary art collection, and then he decided to go ahead on to build his own museum and his own foundation. And what he's doing now is to show actually important private initiative. At the moment, there is a big show of the MoMA, and why MoMA at Louis Vuitton Foundation? It's because MoMA started, as you all know, with a private collector, and it's a museum of a private collector, and that's something that we should always, I think, relate it and make a link between private initiative and museum. Yeah.
And it's interesting for me to hear all your different perspectives, because we think of such reputable institutions as the Guggenheim, as MoMA, as the Whitney, and one has to remember that these all started with private collections. I went the other route, Mohammed, and I took the challenge to open a private museum. My feeling was that this would be the opportunity to show our artists and the trend in art that we so firmly believe in, maybe in a more continued or followed way, and to put together the programs that we wanted to. Having said that, it is not an easy task trying to run an institution, let alone a private one. But I wonder if is there a way that we can collaborate more, as you say, the Vuitton Foundation welcoming private collections and the Aga Khan Museum, and has this happened before in the British Museum? How can we coexist, maybe find a new model to all continue working?
I think there is already a model. I mean, certainly the national museums are collaborating all the time. I mean, you couldn't do anything at all unless you collaborated. So, you know, when we do an exhibition, we're getting loans from private collections as well as public museums. So I think, yeah, I mean, we're all working together, whether it's, you know, we all have our different roles. We're all different pieces of a jigsaw, really, actually.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's no right answer to the question. There are many routes to nirvana, right? And your chosen route makes sense because you're doing something very important here by bringing artists and ideas and themes that are not yet being cultivated. And that would not be easy to do if you didn't have your own foundation which you can control. When you try to promote and do a deal with a large national museum, it can be episodic, it might not happen, it's complicated, it's also contingent on whether it fits in their calendar. So, you know, you give up one thing for another, which is you control the program, but you have to accept that you're going to have a more limited audience, but you get to continuously set the agenda. While if you deal with a larger institution, you know, you're a pawn in a broader chess set, which is fine as long as the pawn keeps moving forward. So there's many ways that you can show your art. And, you know, as I said, for us, we have a specific reason because, you know, we champion as a family, I mean, all art, but with a focus on Iranian art, because Iranian art is still, again, not viewed as much as we would like. And I think in this sort of world we're living in, where there's this increasing tension and divisiveness, art is a good sort of soft middle ground where people can come together rather than disagree. And the national museum foundations and you know, institutions provide a fantastic footing. I mean, to give you a sense, we had our most recent show was at the Houston Museum of Fine Art, which was it was July, August, through the end of September. And of course, you remember there was Hurricane Harvey in the beginning of September. It shut down the museum. But nevertheless, there was such curiosity that in the galleries where we displayed our works, we had over 75,000 visitors, and it was double more than they've ever had for a show of that length. And there was no added PR or anything. It was just genuine curiosity. And now, I will tell you, there was a big Mexican show that we benefited from at the museum. But you know, but from what I gather, the Mexican show wasn't as popular. So they all went down and said, we like this Iranian stuff. So it's important to have both is the answer. Like people like you who are doing what you're doing are as important or more because you bring up ideas, you bring artists that, let's say, are not known in the region like Olivier and would never be known in the region if there wasn't, you know, the show at the Nijjar Foundation. So it's very important what you do. And there are many paths to get the same message across. And now with social media as well, even if you don't have more than, let's say, 10,000 people visiting your show, if you have a very well-managed social media process, you could have hundreds of thousands of viewers. So the ball and the game has changed a bit. But I agree with Venetia, there's been this constant collaboration. But my view is that these museums, some of them are such fantastic structures and they're funded, but they're not necessarily always populated with the best shows or the most interesting shows. So the dialogue's got to continue.
And I would say, just jumping in, working for a big national museum, it is certainly the case that our museums are not nearly as nimble as the private museums and the private foundations. I mean, it can, you know, we have to plan like years in advance, and you can't just slot something in, and there is a logic to it. And I often really am envious of the private museums like you that, or the collections, you know, that you can just suddenly jump in and do something. So that's the downside.
Hervé, what do you see as the how in your work and in helping to build the collections, do you sometimes look forward to this vision of long-term and collections going into major national museums?
Yeah, I think it's one of the key point. I've been to the regions many times, and I've been thankful enough to organize an exhibition of Hassan Sharif a year ago in Brussels at the Patinoire Royale, and it was an amazing experience because I've been able to work with Hassan before he passed away and to organize this show of his last important and monumental sculpture in Brussels. And when I see now what's going on at the Sarja Foundation on all the works, what's done on the exhibition who opened a few days ago and is going to travel to Europe, I think there is still a lot of things to do, especially here in the Middle East, to inform to the audience, especially in Europe and maybe in the United States about what's going on in the region. So maybe you are a keeper, but us as an independent curator, we're trying to pass, we're trying to communicate this belief and this knowledge about what's happening in the region to the most global museum and art structure into the world. And yeah, what you're doing, Deborah, with the foundation, with the Jean-Paul Najar Foundation, is also important because it's to underline very specific artists that your father collect on, which was a key and important artist dealing with abstraction in France and also in United States. And maybe this is a question for you. How do you feel as a private foundation to be here, and how do you communicate, and how do you see the future of your foundation here in the Emirates?
Important question. Thank you. How do I see? I see it very much as you do, as a custodian, because I've been privileged to have this passed on to me. And it's a cultural and intellectual and artistic legacy. And my father says it's an object of thinking that he's given me. And this is how I see it. Maybe to go into the underneath of your thoughts, there are a lot of questions. And I think I have the privilege of heading up the Global Private Museum Network, which is an organization that gathers a large number of private museum founders around the world. And you have some private museums that are the size and have the endowment and the resources of a public museum and often larger acquisition budgets. And then you have smaller organizations like ours, and perennity is a constant thought in the forefront of our mind, because we'd like the story to continue, and we do everything in that direction, but it can be terribly challenging to find ways to do it. And so I don't have an answer to you, but do I think about these issues? Do I discuss them with trusted friends and peers? Yes. And when Mohammed, when you and Olivier say that private collections should end in public museums, and in the absolute, I completely agree. Where I do have an issue is when I start to think, how often will these works be shown, and how much will the collection be brought into the exhibitions? And I'm very aware that I'm not in the position of a Giuseppe Panza or of a Hannelore Schulhoff, where the collection will have that presence. And that's where it's a tricky scenario. But I do have to say one thing, and maybe some of you will have some thoughts about it as well. I've been astounded, and here in the Middle East, coming and doing this project and being amongst the first at the incredible support from the community, and that Abu Dhabi Art have invited us here. That to be working and to be so close with all of you here is a testament to how we all do have similar goals. So I don't have the answer to that. Private museums do close as well around the world, or are sometimes sold on. There's the Uhlens have recently passed on their museum and collections. The Maison Rouge in Paris will be closing down after a fantastic run. And
I don't know what you say. Of course, I mean, even as an artist, you're just learning, and you're learning because these institutions exist. That's the way it works. And I guess, I mean, it's a good idea to be a collector. I'm sure my family would have preferred me to be a collector than an artist. But if you can't help it, you do what you do. And then you're grateful for people who, you know, support that and allow you to go on. So, and also have to say, this globalization is really interesting. To have the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, it's mind-boggling, actually. And the fact that now it's the whole world, you know, you can circulate and find, even see things you had maybe seen before somewhere else. And talking about your collection, which was built in Paris with American artists in Paris and ending up here, it's, I guess, typical of what the world is the direction of the works is going.
And I would say maybe even more particularly the United Arab Emirates, where so much of the world is gathering and so much is happening, and especially at this time.
And for me, I mean, it's an experience to, it's the first time in the Middle East, and say, oh wow, you know, you discover something, and you as I said, you're learning. We'll see what kind of impact it has. I'm getting old, but still, it was very exciting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, just following on Olivier's comment, he made an earlier comment about Paris being, you know, in the old days, the preeminent art destination, then New York, London. What's interesting about the world today, and maybe it's a function of technology or connectivity, but everywhere around the world now, there are mini ecosystems forming. And I think what's great about being here, I mean, just look at the panel. Venetia's English, British, you know, museum, assistant keeper. I'm British, Iranian origin, living in Dubai with a collection that's predominantly Iranian art in Dubai. You're French with your collection, foundation in Dubai. So what it's telling me is that, you know, the UAE certainly is leading the effort to become an international, tolerant hub, a place where no matter where you're from, what your art ambitions or aspirations are, they're supported. So it's very important that whilst it's great to be recognized in these sort of established mega centers, it's perfectly good and great to also, you know, populate your own area. I feel like it's been done so well here by people who support Middle Eastern art that I feel it's more important for me to try to push boundaries elsewhere and then ultimately bring the collection back in some form here. Maybe one day in a show in a great institution like the Louvre, who knows? I'm just throwing an idea out.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I want to say something on just the subject of collaboration. So one of the things you kindly mentioned when you introduced me was that I was the curator for the exhibition which was called Hajj Journey to the Heart of Islam. Well, what's completely wonderful is that there is an exhibition here called Memories of a Journey in the grounds of this amazing structure in the grounds of the Sheikh Zayed Grand Mosque. And this was actually a collaboration with the British Museum where we worked with our colleagues here, and this was an idea, because the idea of going on Hajj is something that actually captures everyone's imagination. And what is so brilliant about the exhibition here is that they've taken that idea and have turned it into a UAE focus. So actually, when you go into the exhibition, you'll see that it's all about people going on Hajj from the UAE. Now, this fantastic exhibition, and I hear it's had 17,000 visitors so far, and it's only been open for just only a few weeks, actually, is an amazing testament to a collaboration where it was an idea working with us, but has been completely sort of taken up and really basically be done here, and that is just fantastic.
So maybe on this note, and we'll open up for a few questions because time is going ahead of us, but I think the beautiful messages that we take home with all these different perspectives, and I wish we could continue to delve into it, but is one of collaboration and and exchanges, and I so look forward to continuing to collaborate with such wonderful curators and collectors and artists and custodians. So thank you very much. And if anyone would like to ask some questions, I believe we have about 10 minutes, Munira.
So I want to ask Mohammed a question, actually, which is really to do with what it now feels like. You've had your, is this the collection which was in your home? It's now been in two public institutions, and I wanted to ask you how it was received in the different places. So in Toronto, was it different from how it was received in Houston?
I think firstly, I have to thank Henry Kim, who's in the audience, for actually making Toronto happen. That all started with a conversation 3.5 years ago, and it resulted in a great show. And I think we were lucky because President Trump aided our efforts by implementing the sort of Muslim travel ban 2 days before the show opened. And of course, we seized on that publicity to sort of act as the sort of counter-Trump message on that front. But the reaction was actually amazing because I went a few times to the show, not just during the opening, but also around the days around it. And it was great to see such different people react with the works. They were so curious, and it was great to see them engage. I mean, frankly, they looked at the works longer than I've ever looked at the works. I mean, they were very, very into it and asking questions. And, at the Aga Khan particularly, they educated all their sort of staff and their sort of tour people on the show, what it was about. And it was interesting to hear the dialogue between some of those people that were being toured around the shows and the guides. So it was very well received with a lot of curiosity. And as I said, on the American side, I didn't see as much because I only came to the end of the show. But again, it was very interesting, especially to see the kids go and see the shows, because the works were full of different installations and different mediums, and they were almost wanting to touch them. Of course, I was about to tackle these kids when they were doing that, but when they were approaching, they were looking at it, curious, asking many questions. So it was, in a way, a similar reaction, but I saw more of it at the Aga Khan Museum because I was there longer. So very satisfying, let me put it that way. Actually, I would say it made me realize that this art shouldn't belong to any single person. That's what it made me realize. That's why I'm so adamant to keep it moving as much as possible, because it's a shame. It's a shame to have it, just for yourself. It's almost selfish.
I think that the way that I really see it is that we're being carried, and it's one of these unstoppable movements, and it's been coming a while. I've been in the UAE for 13 years. Mohammed, you've been here longer than me. Venicia, you've been coming for the longest time. And interestingly, Olivier is his first time here, so such different perspectives to maybe exchange on. The movement has been going for 10 years, and this is just a concretization, the beginning of that next phase. So for myself, very humbly, I try to be a part of it, but I do feel that we are carried here by a greater force, by a greater vision, and that we are contributing to it.
I would add that, that's a great question. My view is I don't take advantage of any trend. I mean, I just keep bulldozing ahead, because the reality is you have to create your own momentum a bit. But I would say that what's interesting about the UAE in particular is you've got this dual track approach to art. One is at the state level, led by these initiatives with the Louvre, hopefully the Sheikh Zayed Museum, and I see Richard Armstrong, and then ultimately the Guggenheim, which is very important because it brings serious global credibility in an instant. But what's going on in Dubai is very interesting. It's very much led by individuals like Deborah, other galleries, other philanthropists, but it's private sector led. Now, if you ask me what's more sustainable in the long run, private sector. I believe that people drive things, not governments. Governments can change, they can change their agendas. So, to keep it relevant, you've got to keep putting it full frontal on the top of everyone's agenda. That's all I do. Everyone gives me the chance, I'm out there. And more. So I'm hoping it will continue, and I think it will, because the reality is Middle East is such a relevant part of the world for all the reasons we know, that having a more positive, softer narrative is always going to be welcome in any discussion regarding the Middle East that's not, discussing politics.
Yeah, but you know, having the Louvre here just means that you're going to come back, because I mean, it's one of. I mean, and we were lucky enough to be able to see part of the collection a little bit quickly. Then you realize you want to come back. But there's a couple of places like the Prado or the Hermitage or something like that. It's part of that network, and this is not going to disappear.
Go ahead.
And so, thank you very much for the talk. Moving on from your point, Mohammed, and addressing Deborah and Wahid, I wondered about the evolution of private collecting, how you saw the evolution of the role of the artists, and how foundations and museums as well are looking at that, particularly in the region.
In doing art, and I guess that's what you're dealing with. But at the same time, as I said, you're grateful that collectors exist, because that's what's keep the whole thing going on. But yeah, there's a dialogue. I mean, that's what I think.
I think what's amazing here is actually the encounter with artists. I think that's what makes our job such fun, is meeting artists and really being just understanding how they think and so on. And just last night at the opening, I mean, there must have been 5 or 6 artists that I met. You know, Muhammad Ibrahim standing in his room that I want to live in forever, and you know, and Dia Azawi, and all these amazing people, Muhammad Omar Khalil. I mean, so many in Jamahdawi. It's a real privilege to be with these people, actually. And I think that's one of the really nice things about this collaboration between institutions, art fairs, collectors, private, national museums, and in the Hajj exhibition, actually there is the work of Mohammed Kazem, for example, and Nadan Salwa who made this beautiful pavilion. And this kind of collaboration between artists and all these institutions is terribly important, and it's very, very rich here. So it's how to turn the UAE artifacts into art. But the question, what is art? That is we can go down a whole rabbit hole here. So are you talking about your own collection, which is different kinds of things from the UAE? Yes. But of course, all these art, every single object, a historical object or even a contemporary object, tells a story. And the job of a museum, the job of curators, is to actually tell that story, to put all those objects together. So, you know, when you go to the museum in Al Ain, which I gather is being refurbished now, you know, you can really see the history of this region through these objects. So these artifacts are very, very powerful, and put together in the right way, they can really, really inform people about their heritage. I'm not sure if I've answered your question. Well, that's a kind of an education, yeah, definitely. But I'm sure that here that students are studying history and archaeology, and so maybe there's more to be done in that way.
To carry on from Venicia, I think something that's terribly important, and I think for all of us, is the role of, indeed, scholarship and writing and inscribing historical text on artworks, artists, periods and movements, and that may be a way for you to start advancing in that route, is to find maybe that PhD student who would like to delve into your collection and start to develop maybe a book and take it from there.
Masters, bachelors, you name it, 0 to 100. And there's a beautiful space, basically open to the Arts are the art studio, which encourage that from a very young age. And it's changing a lot. So it's developing a lot. And one of the major roles of the Zaylash Museum, inshallah, when it opens outside Riyadh, is to actually focus on that UAE heritage, UAE material, speak to private collectors, see what do they have, and have it all exhibited to the world. And I think it's a statement for everyone that very soon there will be something to the public on the Zaylash Museum and we can do it for everyone.
And I would add also, Mr. Khoury, you talked about your 8,000 artifacts. In so much as you haven't or you have, I would encourage you that while you have all these works in one place or wherever they may be, that you start organizing the works in a way where you can start presenting it to the Zayed Museum. Even the Najar Foundation, they might do a show on UAE artifacts. I mean, they're pretty open-ended architecture there. I'm not suggesting you do, but you can approach many places that are now becoming available to take private collections. But to do that, you need to organize it in a way where it's coherent and you don't just show up with, here's a list of 8,000 works, because it's almost like you've got to gift wrap it to get people to take an interest. It's too much work otherwise. But that's inexpensive work for you, and great pleasure when you have your own team archiving your work, because then you actually understand what you own at a level that you never thought you could.
I think on this note we will wrap up. Thank you very much, Tor, for coming. Thank you to the wonderful panelists. Thank you very much.